and welcome everybody to the last event in the Rethinking Diversity in Publishing Week, which has been incredibly engaged. We'll refer to that a bit later. Update everyone. Today's topic is the future publishing pipeline, meeting the needs of writers of colour. So before I introduce the panel, what I'd like to do is a few Zoom housekeeping guides for you, so it's just as effective as possible with everyone, for everyone. We have two BSL interpreters, Ali Pottinger and Sharon Thind, and they will switch every 15 minutes. Please send your questions and comments to all panelists and all attendees. And to help us differentiate between comments and questions, please put your questions in capital letters. We'd really appreciate it. And this is being moderated by Felone, the bookseller. Make her life and my life a lot easier. And also, this discussion will be recorded and made available post-launch. My name is Joy Francis. I'm Executive Director of Words of Colour Productions, and I will be guiding you and navigating you through this, what I think will be engaged, inspired conversation, no pressure to our panelists. Now, I'd like to introduce you to our panelists. They are Professor Singh, co-founder of the Jhalak Prize, and also literature academic, Nikesh Shukla, who is an author, and also co-founder of the Good Literary Agency, Paterson, who is literary agent with Aitken Alexander Associates, Aimée, Felone, who is a publisher at Microsoft, and Derek Owusu, who sadly will not be able to join us today, but I will be raising some of the points that he would like us to explore during the discussion today. Also, alongside our great panel, we will be joined by Dr. Anamik, Saha and Dr. Sandra van Lente, who are co-authors of Rethinking Diversity in Publishing. And if you haven't read it yet, please download it from the Spread the Word site. And to say, Rethinking Diversity in Publishing is a partnership between Goldsmiths University of London, the bookseller, and Spread the Word. So before we dive into the discussion with the panel, we've obviously had the launch of the Black Writers Guild. We are still reeling and responding to the Black Lives Matters, anti-racism and anti-racist protests in response to the murder of George Floyd. And that is making us focus quite appropriately and sharply on what we need to do going forward. And the report is a roadmap to help with that process. I want to bring in Professor Singh. Sunny, you know, you are an author, you are an academic, you are championing writers of colour through the Jhalak Prize. You also say, along with Dorothy Kumson, that publishing industry currently is a hostile environment. What do you mean by that? And what impact do you think this is having and has had on writers of colour?
Well, I mean, I do think it's a hostile environment on multiple levels. The way writers of colour are published, the way they're received, the way they're read, the way if they are reviewed or not reviewed, and I suppose I should add a not to every one of those. The way they are sold in bookshops. I mean, at all levels, the hostility is there. And I think what I want to start thinking about and talking about, because, you know, the Jhalak Prize was born as, in some ways, you know, as a consequence of the 2015 Writing the Future report, which kind of precedes this one. And at that point, I really went in working off the idea that, you know, the industry may be acting in good faith, that, you know, they are trying to do their best. We can change things because, you know, we're at the end on the same side. I no longer can believe that, because if 400 years ago, Afra Ben could understand why equality is necessary, it's not a question of not knowing or not understanding. To me now, it's a question of moral failure on part of the industry. And I want to raise a question. We've said this over and over and over again, not just for a couple of years, not for 5 years or 4 years of the Jhalak Prize, or 10 years and 20 years and 50 years. This has been ongoing for a few centuries. What is it that you don't get? And second, is it that you're refusing to get it? Are you refusing to understand? What does it say about you? And why are you refusing to get it?
Now, you also, this follows on, Sunny, to, because we've had so many discussions and terminology that's been developed around this, the business case, which is now a business imperative. We have the moral case, and now we have hostile environment. All these things that you would think that we're debating with Boris Johnson or trying to in the House of Commons. So you also say it isn't rocket science for publishers to meet the needs of writers of colour, from sign them, publish them, market them effectively. Yet, as you say, this is isn't happening. What do the big publishers have to do to convince you that they're getting the message? What do you need to see? As someone who is a writer, well, and inspire the next generation to write.
Well, it's something that's really interesting that's come up in the 4 years of the Jhalak Prize running. Writers who are longlisted, writers who don't even make the long list, one of the things they tell us constantly is that it's the one prize they feel that the judges just read their work. They don't have to go through the process of, is this about race? Is this saying the right thing? How is this going to be interpreted? Oh, I don't understand these terms, etc., etc., etc. Right? Our judges just read it. And it's increasingly become obvious that that needs to happen in publishing. We need to see agents. We need to see publishers, editors at all levels. Now, you said about the commercial case, the business case. Where are people of color in the executive suites? Why aren't we seeing them at the top of the ladder? Why aren't we? I don't want to see one discrete imprint by a big publisher. I want to see an editor and a publisher of color at the top of the big four, and not just one person. It's not good enough to say, we now have another project to recruit people. Pay them, promote them, get them to the top, empower them to make the decisions. So for me, for the publishing industry to convince me that they're doing something, I want to see those changes at the top of the ladder, not just, oh, we've recruited another batch who will end up leaving in 5 years because they're burnt out and they're so exhausted and frustrated. That's what I need the publishing industry to do.
One of your winners, Renee Lodge, she has been very vocal and consistently so about her own mental well-being, about having to answer to every question in relation to race, and just the pressures that's put on writers of colour to be everything and all things to all people, and experts, in transforming an industry that the onus really is on to do that themselves. I want to also talk about education. I'm going to come to that. But what have the long-listed writers, and others who have applied for the Jhalak Prize, as well as the winners, what are they saying to you about its impact? Because also the discussions about the future publishing pipeline, and you're aiding that. So what have they been saying to you? Because obviously, I want to acknowledge, Sunny, the fact that when you first launched it, people just think you just launch these prizes. There's a lot of thought and also a lot of anxiety. Rethinking Diversity in Publishing talks about the anxiety of a lot of the white sales team and others. But what is really discussed is the anxiety of and experienced by writers of colour when they launch things like this, because, it was nearly derailed because of challenges from politicians and everything else. I think that needs to be acknowledged and applauded, that you navigated an incredibly difficult space to make sure the Jhalak Prize is here for everyone. So, do you want to speak to that?
Well, yes. I think it links back to some of the other questions you asked earlier. So, the anxiety of speaking out and speaking up is constant. I had to very clear have a conversation with my agent and say, you do realize this may end any chances of me being published in Britain. And she very sweetly said, well, you know, Britain isn't the only market. And I am very, very fortunate that I have an agent who can think of that and see that. But there's also interpersonal anxieties. You know, it's sort of, you know, what would my writer friends who are white say? And they have said some really quite awful things. And I've lost friendships over the Jhalak Prize, if you can call those friendships. And I do want to make this point. You know, when I spoke about the moral failures, it's not just the publishing industry. I want to say, why aren't writers who are white standing with us? Why aren't they speaking up? It's like, you know, we keep talking about, you know, food metaphors. I'm from India, you know, we write food constantly. We're all about food. If you were sitting around a dining table and you watched somebody that you consider a friend, and you go to their homes and you come to, you know, they come to yours, and you saw them not being served the food on that same table, would you not speak up? And I want to now ask white writers, why aren't they speaking up? Because we're on that table, supposedly. Where is the food?
Well, I'm not even going to attempt to answer that, and let that hang in the air, and those who need to respond to that, let them respond. I just want to, you know, one last question for you just for now, Sunny, is in relation to academia, because as I said at the launch event on Tuesday, you know, publishers are part of a wider ecosystem, and creative writing courses, you know, we're absent there too, and there's a whole system and structural obstacles that exist there as well. And I mean, you operate within that same system and structure. What do you think educationalists need to think about in relation to this and do? I mean, we have the Aimée in Black British Writing at Goldsmiths, and Deirdre Osborne, who's worked so hard and tirelessly, you know, to ensure that over 5 years, they've got some amazing graduates through that. But it's always under scrutiny and under threat. So what would you say needs to be done? And what would you be looking to do as recently appointed professor? Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, it hasn't sunk in, that professor bit, but yeah.
I'm liking it.
For a long time. And I'm very fortunate because I work for one of the 2 universities in the country that is explicitly committed to decolonization as a strategic goal. But that makes me wonder what's happening elsewhere. And all of the same arguments that I've made, whether it's a moral case or a business case, a cultural national case, because as a country, we need to include people. All of the cases apply to academia. We need to decolonize pedagogy. We need to decolonize our syllabus. I don't want to teach on a course where, or learn from a course where, you know, there is the one post-colonial week, or there's one racial equality week, and they read James Baldwin or Alice Walker or Toni Morrison. I mean, it's been amazing to watch on Twitter for the last month, where white writers are talking about their great readership. And those are really the 3 names that keep coming up. It's like, is that all you read? And I think that is up to academics as well. Your curriculum should not require someone else to say that. If you aren't decolonizing your own practice, your teaching practice, your reading practice, you're letting down your students, your colleagues, but more than that, again, it's a moral failure, but it's also a failure of intellect. It's a failure of understanding and doing your job as an academic if you are refusing to read and teach writers who are not white. And this is not just for creative writing, it cuts across all over. If you're teaching architecture and all you can think of are white architects, and that's what you're teaching, you need to rethink your own intellectual capacity and your intellectual rigor.
Thanks, Sunny. So much to digest there. Appreciate it. And Nikesh, I want to bring you in here now. Something that you said, you know, you've acknowledged the writers, Black writers who have supported you as mentors for many years. And I mean, and you acknowledge that, you know, consistent developmental mentorship is sorely absent in publishing. And as I said, in relation to you, yet many successful Black and brown writers regularly acknowledge and call out the support they've received from other writers who are Black and brown. Why do you think these kinds of mentorship programs for writers of colour aren't getting a foothold or the required investment in publishing?
If I'm being honest, I think it's because people don't think it's sexy. I think people want a sexy solution to fixing the diversity problem. And mentorship is about time, and it's about listening, and it's about putting the needs of those writers first. And it's not a quick solution. Like mentoring, like working with writers who've been writing in the margins for years, sometimes those writers need a lot more development around their confidence, around, you know, feeling a certain amount of imposter syndrome. And, you know, I would not have a career if at one point in my life, Nee Quay Parks and Korche Newland and Rajiv Balasubramanian put me in an anthology. If I hadn't met Bernardine Evaristo at the Big Chill Festival in like 2006, and she had told me about the realities of being published if you're not right, if I hadn't met Nivin Govindan and Selena Godin and, you know, them supported me through to, you know, having my first book published. And I stand on their shoulders, and I stand on the shoulders of so many writers who've kind of come before me. And I think often I can't ever pay them back for those critical interventions they made into my life and my career and my confidence, but I can pay it forward. And so, you know, I mentor a lot of writers. I do it either through like proper schemes, through the Rathbones Folio mentorship scheme, or I do it informally, but I really think that it's an important way of writers feeling confident in the work, and also writers realizing the time that it takes to write a novel and to kind of find your voice. And because a lot of these writers, they can't afford to do a Faber Academy thing or a Curtis Brown creative thing, or even an MA at UEA or Goldsmiths, or even evening classes. You know, like a lot of these people need to work and have other things that they might want to study. And it's, so I just think that mentoring is something that I've always done, and a lot of the writers of colour around me all do it, and none of us ever question why we do it. We do it because it was what was done for us, and it's why we're here today. But I do think that there are certain publishing schemes like Right Now and, you know, the Future Bookshelf that I've kind of hinted at that mentoring side, but the mentoring kind of has to sort of start from early on, and it has to go on through the publishing process and beyond being actually published to actually talk about this stuff. Like if I had known about the mental toll it takes to kind of constantly do events and talk about racism, and you know, when I was doing all the Good Immigrant events and all the rest of it, then if someone had sort of told me that mental toll it would take, then I would have sort of thought twice about sort of making myself so available. But now I can do that message with people, and when I mentor people, the same things kind of come up. I know that everyone thinks that like publishing is very transparent about its processes and there are loads of resources, but the thing is, when you're a writer who doesn't really know how the industry works and you Google how do I get published, you get millions and millions and millions of hits, all with like very different opinions, and you're sort of paralyzed going, well, how do I, where do I even start with this? And I do think that the publishing industry is quite opaque. Like for years I didn't know why I needed a literary agent, or you know what a copy editor does, or you know what the difference between a publicist and a sales and marketing person is. And I've kind of learned through experience, but like those questions kind of come up again and again, and a lot of the writers that I mentored, you know, other questions come up. They're like, I've had to field questions in the last 3 weeks where, you know, when all these conversations have been happening, where writers have been like, can you just be real with me? Is this a racist industry? And I'm not going to lie to them and go, no, you know, it's all gin and cake chat, which, you know, but I've been real with them, and the other thing that writers say is like, you know, we see that all the successful books by writers of color are all about race. Should I just give up on this like sci-fi idea that I'm writing and write a book about race? I'm like, no, write the book that you want to write. Like, obviously I write about race because it's something that I'm very interested in. It's sort of my life's work, but like, that doesn't mean that you should be. You write the book that you want to write, but that messaging isn't out there for those writers. And I have been really frustrated with the lack of interrogation of these issues by my fellow peer white writers. You know, this is your, like, I don't know how many of you white writers are watching this webinar. I hope you are, but I'm just going to say one thing to you. This is your industry, and the stuff that's going on is disgusting. And the fact that it rests on the shoulders of all of the black and brown writers and all the black and brown people working in publishing to do all the work, it takes a toll. I just want to write. All I ever wanted to do was write. Like, I don't want to be doing all of this extra work. Like, imagine that you were sitting here watching a webinar where Singh, the writer, and Derek Arusu, the writer, and Nikesh, Shukla, the writer, get to talk about craft. That'd be amazing. We never get invited to talk about craft. Instead, we're constantly talking about the need for our books to exist, the right for our books to exist, which by extension talks about our own right to take up space and exist. And so what writers of color, white writers, if you're feeling like, if you're putting your discomfort about having these conversations before people's humanity, then you really need to check that. Because, you know, we've been saying this for years, as Sunny has said, like, it needs you to put in the work as well. It needs you to not just like do your pontificating highly intellectual threads about you know, the mechanics of publishing. It needs you to put in work. It needs you to amplify black and brown voices, but it also needs you to hold a hand out and also ask those questions. Like, talk to your literary agent. If your literary agent only represents one black person and they only took them on in the last month, talk to them and go, look, what's going on? Like, talk to your publisher. Like, don't feel like, you know, you're going to have any of this taken away from you. Like, the potential for writers of color to kind of burn bridges and not have careers because of speaking out is far greater. You are not going to lose any work because of this stuff. Just be braver. I really urge you to be braver. Like, I felt really dismayed that when the publishing paid me hashtag hit the UK a couple of weekends ago, like, apart from me and a couple of other brown and black writers, Matt Haig was like the only one who joined in, and that was amazing of him. But like, where were you? Like, where were you highlighting that inequality? I saw your highly overly intellectual threads about it, but what are you actually doing? What are you doing to further this cause? I don't want to keep having this conversation. I just want to write my books, and like, be quiet and get on with my life. Like, do you think Phoebe Waller-Bridge and Nick Hornby are sitting around having this conversation day after day after day? Like, I only get to be like 60% a writer, and over 40% of my life is taken up doing this other work. Like, imagine if I got to be 100%. I give 100% to the thing that I want to do. I imagine I'd be unstoppable, but the truth is I'll never know because I constantly have to do this work. So it's time for you to pick up the slack now. Thank you.
Well, you answered my second question, Nikesh, before even asking it, because I think, you know, obviously segued and flowed, you know, very readily and easily into the fact that, you know, you're not just a writer of color, you know, a black or brown writer, you're a literary activist, you're a mentor, you're an anti-racist activist, you end up being a publisher, or a tutor and a lecturer, and juggling all these roles and caring for your well-being, and yet expected to produce quality writing. So, and in your case, obviously you're running the Good Literary Agency as well. A similar question to Sunny, because again, you know, we're trying to make this as future-facing as possible. What then needs to happen to shift this challenging and underappreciated and under-acknowledged reality? Especially in relation to the, you know, just how you're having to position yourself as well as being positioned by others.
Step one, white writers, turn on your masters and push back against all of this stuff. Your insights into this report is just as important as ours. I do also think that if you have the time and capacity to, mentoring is a really wonderful thing that you can do if you have the time. If you've got an hour a week or 2 hours a week, I earmark 6 hours a week to do mentoring every single week. And you know, that if you're able to do that, then please do, because like, a lot of writers, they just need time and a bit of active listening and a critical friend, someone who can help them through when like the confidence is getting in the way, but also can help them with technical stuff, but also can help them with networking. So, you know, do that. I think the other thing, you know, as Sunny has said, and as has been said all week, I think we need to widen the scope of what writers of color get to write about. You know, I really want to see like more sci-fi and crime hitting the bestseller charts. Like, it was amazing to see Britt Bennett hit the bestseller charts alongside Bernie, alongside Rennie. Like, that was it felt like such an amazing moment. But as Rennie said, like, it's such a shame that she was the first. She sort of felt like conflicted about that. And I think that we need to talk about how we can also better support as you know, within our constituent parts in the industry, better support the indies who are already doing all of this work and putting out all these amazing books. But I think the main thing I would say to people is, like, this isn't a loop-de-loop problem. You can't blame another part, the next part in the chain of publication, as being the reason that you're not doing your bit. Like, if we were all working in a factory, in a car factory, and if I was responsible for the carburetor, I wouldn't care about the person who's working on the wheels. No, I would care about the person who's working on the wheels, but I'd make sure I'd be doing my best to make the carburetor work. And I'd be hoping that the person who's doing the work on the wheels would make the wheels work. So, like, just take stock of your own station in this chain. See what you're doing, check yourself, ask yourself uncomfortable questions, ask uncomfortable questions of your colleagues. Like, just be uncomfortable. It's okay to be uncomfortable. Like, I've been uncomfortable having these conversations in the last few weeks because I've had to check various things about myself and the work that I do and the work that various projects I run do. Like, we all have to feel uncomfortable.
Thank you, Nikesh. I think that I want to draw upon some of the points that you've raised, and also it's an opportunity for Anamik and Sandra to come in here, because in Derek Owusu's absence, and for those of you who may have just joined us, welcome. And we're discussing the needs of Black writers, writers of colour, and also the future publishing pipeline. And the prompt for this is the Rethinking Diversity in Publishing report, the first report of its kind, which looks at diversity in trade fiction and also the wider publishing sector. And Dr. Sandra van Lente and Dr. Anamik Saha are the co-authors of that report. Now, following on from what Nikesh has said, I mean, this is something that from, you know, In Full Colour, the first report in 2004 around publishing and diversity, which obviously feels much softer compared to where we are now with your report. But this has been a consistent theme, which would actually go against any business, that after 16 years, there are writers across from all backgrounds and walks of life who still do not understand how the publishing industry works, you know, and but also how to get an agent. And this is one of the things that Derek and I, you know, would have discussed, which is in relation to, you know, as a new writer, you know, Murky Books, the imprint inaugural signing, with That Reminds Me, but also someone who, through Sapient anthology in relation to Black British masculinity, and he wants to champion Black male voices in literature. But there's so many questions that he, as a new writer, an emerging writer, has to respond to around: how do you get an agent? How do you determine what a good agent is? At what stage of your career? You know, how do you negotiate your contracts? What does publishing actually do for you? Do you have a say in the covers? You know, and this is someone who's an emerging writer, and some of these questions he can't answer. So it's an indictment, wouldn't you say, on the industry, that if you're welcoming people, we should be informed.
I guess I'll go first.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll hand over to Sandra to talk more about this, but you know, one of the things that I think hopefully the report can do is shine a light on these processes. You know, one of the biggest interventions I hope the report's going to make is to say, you know, often when we think about issues of diversity in publishing, it's about where are the writers of colour, what are agents and editors doing to find them, and those issues are absolutely right. But I really like Nikesh's kind of a metaphor of the car and the different parts, right? And there's processes that I think writers can kind of, you know, they're so obviously involved in their craft, as they should be, but how, it's not just about what stories we tell, but how they get out there. That's the, I think for me, the really crucial issue. And if this report can help, and I really implore like writers to read this, just to understand how the process works. Not just, you know, obviously the having an agent and the importance of that, but also how the marketing team and promotions team are going to work with your book, how the sales person is going to work with your book in terms of getting out in whatever channels. These are all potential obstacles and challenges that writers of colour need to understand in order to better negotiate and challenge. The only thing before I hand over to Sandra, the only other thing I'd say is that opacity, that lack of transparency, that in a way is precisely what allows the industry of a status quo to stay as it is, you know. And it is, and in the interviews that we did, you know, it came out that, you know, this issue of, like, for instance, how writers of colour don't know about agents. You know, how would you know? One person said, how would you know? Unless you hang out, you belong to a milieu where you meet people whose parents either work in the industry or are agents and so on. It's a kind of, you know, in kind of a very exclusive form of knowledge. And the industry definitely, as one step, make its processes more transparent. So not least in order to appear more exclusive, but actually to empower writers of colour to make the right choices and to help them, as I say, tell the stories that they want to tell, whether it's about race or not, in the way that they want to tell them.
Sandra, is there anything you want to add to what
yes, please.
said? Mm-hmm.
Because like, yeah, as Anamik said, like what we often also encounter in terms of question is like, yeah, but how can we do it? How can we start it? Well, there are those wonderful writing development institutions all over the country, like Spread the Word, who partnered up with us for this report, like Writing West Midlands in Birmingham, who I visited, and they are doing programs for emerging writers. Spread the Word does the London Writers Award, for example. In Birmingham, I encountered the Spark Initiative for Young Writers that really starts with children to like get them interested in the craft. And the thing is, these institutions already do a lot of work with like the very limited budget they have, but imagine what they could do if bigger publishers partnered up with them, like on eye level strategically and not as a one-off kind of thing. That would really make a difference. And it doesn't look so difficult for me, to do that. I mean, they are already there. They have the connections to the communities. They are approachable. There's not the same barrier to going to Spread the Word as it is to going into the Strand or something like that. So yes, please use those resources and support them. That's something
I want to come back to the last point in relation to collaborations. I mean, what you're hearing, you know, when, you know, what Nikesh has said, or from what Sunny said, I mean, they couldn't do what they do without collaborators. And yet that seems to be less visible or less of a trend within publishing, in terms of that dynamic, proactive engagement with those who are actually making the difference, who are doing the innovation outside the, you know, the publishing world itself. I mean, is that something that you came across in your interviews about that not maybe seen as a priority, but yet that has consistently been illustrated through the 3 reports now on publishing as a way forward?
Yeah, certainly not encountered as a priority. We've encountered a couple of examples where agencies partnered up with publishers, for example, and created a prize, and also like created a pipeline through that and created more visibility. But I mean, I'm just guessing, but I mean, it's a competitive industry. Maybe there is this fear that somebody's going to poach somebody. But if you look at, for example, the Common People project and report, they managed to like at least get all the writing development organizations to work together. So I think that's the way forward.
Well, thank you, Sandra and Anamik. I now want to bring in, we've heard agents mentioned often in the first part of this discussion. Emma Paterson, I'd like to bring you in here as an agent yourself. You know, agents as the primary gatekeeper, especially the big agents and agencies, got quite a rough ride in the report. as a primary gatekeepers. I mean, what type of agent would you say you are, and what concerns you about how the big agents manage this gatekeeping role where writers of colour are concerned?
Yeah, hi.
Hi,
I guess the first thing I'd say is that I think it's right that agents got a rough ride in the report. I think that that response is completely justified, and that you know, the first thing that really concerns me is the very stark failure, and failure is a word that's come up throughout this panel. Moral failure, intellectual failure. I think that failure is so stark when you look at the major agencies and the most powerful agents working in this country. I don't think we can kind of ignore or escape that reality. So that concerns me on the one hand. What really concerns me on the other hand is some of the response to this that I've seen from agents in the wake of the global Black Lives Matter protests has been really quite distressing, quite triggering, and quite dismaying, if I'm honest. You know, I saw a number of people sort of suddenly issuing or declaring these call-outs to communicate that they were suddenly or now open to Black writers and brown writers. I mean, really, what does that say about you? What were you doing before? And if you're now open to those writers, why on earth should those writers have faith in you or have confidence in you to represent their work ethically or represent their work outside of this particular moment? I mean, the way it was handled, I just thought was really appalling, when actually it should be a time to listen, to self-interrogate, to really look at why you have failed, rather than to profit suddenly from Black Death. So what concerns me about it is that on the one hand, it's not happening at all. And on the other hand, it's happening, but in completely the wrong way. I mean, that's my opinion.
I mean, there's a lot of concern, isn't it, about meaningful change cannot be sustained on shame and blame, and, you know, and guilt. And obviously that, you know, those three seem to have played a role in the reactions and responses at the moment. I mean, you know, one thing Meryl Halls, you know, the MD of the Booksellers Association, has said, you know, about there needs to be an imperative, because then we're dealing with sometimes they're family-run firms, they're commercial, there's been no imperative, which actually then doesn't necessarily reflect well on them, because then it's about choice, because there isn't, you know, a public mandate that they have to do particular things, like with the BBC. So, but you're working within this, and I mean, you know, you know, when your name comes up, Emma, it's incredibly positive response. So what, and I think again, sort of responding to the question about what does an agent do. So I'm not going to get you to focus on that, but it comes back to the second part of that question about what type of agent are you within this environment, and what type of agent do you aspire to be, and what sort of writers are you working with and looking for?
Well, I mean, I think a central part of the role of any agent is discovery, and that's obviously come up a lot in these conversations, is how people are discovering, and what really exhausts me is the constant hand-wringing from some agents and some publishers. You know, this kind of this sense that they'd like to do better, but they don't know where to find writers. I mean, that is patently ridiculous. You know, you just the writers are there; they've always been there. The onus is really on the agent, given the agent's role is to find talent, is to go and look for them. And the other thing to say is that once your list becomes more representative, you know, you build that way. So again, through recommendation, or from just the sense that you give to a writer that they are welcome on your list, and that your list is a kind of safe space for them to be, and for their work to be nurtured on that list. So discovery is an important part of what I do. I think it's the most rewarding part in many ways. And of course, nurturing, so a lot of editorial development, but that is true of any agent-writer relationship. And yeah, that's the type of agent that I am. And when I set out to build a list, you know, I wanted it to reflect my reading, basically. And my reading is, you know, I'll read some writers in which my own experience is reflected back to me. I'll read lots of writers in which that's not the case. I mean, that seems to me what reading is. It's not a particularly revolutionary idea. So this idea that it's hard, it's just a nonsense, really, and comes back to, I think, what Sunny was saying about, you know, you start to believe that actually there's an investment in doing the opposite, because it's not hard. It's not actually challenging, you know.
And it's interesting. I mean, the thing I have to say, I suppose, is that, you know, there are very few literary agents of colour, and I'm aware of all of them, and the majority of Black women. You know, and I think it's, again, about the transparency and why that's important to inspire others to be agents. Because now, hearing from you, someone listening to this, I mean, we've got nearly 250 people signed up for this webinar, who then would say, you know what, because some of the things you were saying speaks to what Nikesh was talking about in terms of this whole informal, I think people don't categorize it as such, but mentorship and support that they instinctively, intuitively do, because they don't want to be the only writers in that landscape. They want as many voices as possible out there. And it seems as if, I think it's good to have that in the public space. So those who may really be good agents know they've already got the qualities to do that and to transition into that role. So I really appreciate you sharing that with us, Emma. And before I go to Aimée Felone, publisher of Nights Of, I just want to remind everyone that please send through your questions and your comments, and please put your questions in capital letters so that when we do come to them later on and try and get through as many of them as possible, we can distinguish. So I really, really appreciate that. Aimée, I want to bring you in. But firstly, bearing in mind, I mean, so much that's what's been said, so it's great on one level, hopefully no pressure on you, that you're appearing at this point in the discussion. Firstly, I have to say congratulations on Inclusive Indies exceeding this £100,000 target. The fact that you had the foresight to set it up, the fact you did it in such a collaborative way, and the fact that other Inclusive Indies are going to benefit alongside yourself and Jacaranda and scores of writers and readers. So I just want to sort of put that out there first. But also alongside that, I want to draw attention to the fact that, you know, up until the Black Lives Matter global protests, let's make that specific once again, global protests, that there was a significant leap in donations, including from publishers, in response. So what does, even though great, because at the end of the day, you had a goal, you reached that goal, and now you can do the work that you set up to do. But what did that signal? It's almost like, you know, it's catch-22, bittersweet, because what does that signal to you about being an inclusive publisher in today's environment and world?
Yeah, the whole reason we set up Inclusive Indies was to support inclusive independent publishing houses in the UK that were suffering because of the global, you know, the coronavirus. We had been hit the hardest, I think, you know, the entire industry had been hit by the pandemic, but the independents had been hit even harder, with many of them, you know, putting statements out to say they would have to close or that they would have to just stop production of their books. And so we saw a massive jump, and I'm talking, we made £30,000 plus from the Saturday to the Monday. And this was at a time when the fund had been running for 2 weeks, and we had been shouting into what seemed to be an abyss, you know, shouting loudly about the fact that we're here, we're doing the work, we need the support. And had even, you know, sent press releases out ahead of time, to bigger publishing houses to make them aware that this was coming, and if they wanted to have conversations beforehand, we would love to, and received very little response. You know, we had, I think, about 300 supporters and maybe around the 10K mark, but nowhere near what we were trying to get, which was £100,000. And so after, you know, George Floyd's murder in the States and the protests that were taking place both here and in America, the rise was literally out, you know, off the charts. I think we were inundated with, you know, notes of support, emails from big houses which were suddenly flooding in to be like, things are coming from us. And to us it seemed as though, which is symptomatic of the UK, I think, when there's a problem over there with race, it's something that will then draw attention to the fact that there's a problem here. And I'm appreciative completely that there was a light that was shown in the States that, you know, made us consider our own positioning. But I struggle with, and have always struggled with, the fact that the support from the UK for the work that Independence is doing seems to be sorely lacking. And so, yeah, I think it shows that the UK is still, as we know, extremely uncomfortable with its position on race, with its position on racism specifically within publishing, and they don't know how to handle it unless it becomes a bigger, wider topic of something over there.
Yeah, and also I had to note those who, you know, acknowledged that they, you know, they made a donation. And I know a common refrain was, you know, many big publishers plead poverty. And I always find it interesting, you know, and obviously when COVID-19 impacted on the world, that obviously everyone battened down the hatches and it's all about self-preservation. And yet in this situation, all of a sudden, money came from somewhere. So I think that's something that I think is going to not sit well with a lot of people. And I think once we can move beyond the situation that we're in now, in terms of our health and safety, that has to be responded to, I would say, I would imagine. You've worked both in the corporate and independent arenas. Yeah. You know, as a young publisher, and you know, each time you're faced with all white sales team, all white marketeers, and you know, some of the things that have been presented to you, isn't it, about, you know, that when you say you have Black writers and, you know, writers of color, that they categorize the narratives as traumatic. Yeah. And also when you face retailers, you know, they tell you finding Black writers are hard. It's hard, but I find Black writers is hard. So how are you navigating this landscape, you know, and trying to retain some positivity when you go into rooms and you want to believe the narrative will be different, but yet you've got to steel yourself for hearing the same thing?
I think the common thread between all of us as speakers that we're hearing about is the entire ecosystem of publishing, and that there are problems in every single, you know, area. I've definitely been in meetings where I've heard those higher up at the time say, you know, putting Black and brown children on the covers of books is going to significantly impact your sales. I have heard sales teams say, you know, oh, there are 2 girls on the cover of this book, let alone the fact that one of the girls is brown. How on earth are we going to sell this? And so you're coming up against structural problems at every step of the way. And I think working in a bigger house is obviously harder to get your voice across when you are the only one in the room. And I've seen the looks, I've heard the comments, you know, that's Aimée with her Black issues. We will sort that out, you know? And I think the thing with Nights Of is that our intention is to publish commercial children's stories that don't lean on that trauma narrative, that don't have to have a historical backing or have a weight on the characters' shoulders, whether it be their race, their disability, their gender. I think we are just ultimately trying to publish stories for children that are representative. And it shouldn't be groundbreaking. And I don't actually think it is. I don't think what we're doing should be lauded as amazing, because it's not. We're just doing what needs to be done, and what unfortunately isn't being done by the larger houses. I think there is a assumption that unless you are selling a trauma narrative, it's not going to be appealing to a reader. And I don't know where this has come from. And I think the rise of a few children's books, young adult titles that have seen a success off of that specific narrative isn't symptomatic of what sells. You know, we have sold a murder mystery novel in amazing quantities. We have sold novels which are about kids running in massive quantities. There shouldn't be this stipulation that our writers for children's books have to write traumatic stories.
But the thing is, you also, let's be clear, Round Table Books, you actually have your own store.
Yeah.
You have spaces. I love it. You know, it took me back, it took me forward, you know, where children come in with their parents, browse, they can read, you know, like the good old days of the libraries. And, you know, and that's a huge investment, not just in terms of time and curation. But it seems to me, I mean, something, again, we discussed at the launch event around where is the true innovation happening?
Yeah.
And not just that, the fact that publishers seem to be speaking their own language, which is not in tune and reflective of where writers and the real creativity is currently.
Yeah.
And I think it's almost like that has to be explored and looked at, because otherwise, even when they start directly being proactive and engaging a range of writers and indie publishers like yourself, that they may lose you again because they lost you the first time. Let's be clear, you know, you, Crystal from Own It London, they've lost talented people, Mags at Jacaranda. You know, the corporates have lost talented people to the independent innovation leading space.
Yeah, the black and brown friends that I have who are in corporate publishing at the moment are not only having to commission titles, you know, I think I have very few friends who are at a high enough level to be commissioning, but they are also having to deal with the fact that these conversations now are an additional job within their job that they're doing. And that additional job doesn't give them the power then to go and find these writers. It just means that they're having to take up another struggle. And I think there's something to be said to the fact that what they should be doing, you know, like so many writers in this webinar are saying, is they should just be able to go and find the writers that they want to find. They should be able to publish the books they want to publish, design the books they want to publish, but they're unable to because of the wider structure that is telling them, no, we now need to be taught by you.
It seems like there's more compartmentalization rather than any understanding of intersectionality, isn't it? It's like that's how they seem to interpret intersectionality, which when it's completely different. But final question, Aimée, at this point, what are your priorities? Look, you know, hopefully you've recovered, because it was damn hard work that you and Valerie Brandes at Jacaranda did, and I know it was hosted, you know, administered by Spread the Word. It is taxing. Let's not you know, beat around the bush, you know, in relation to crowdfunding, especially on that scale. Yeah. What are your now the dust has settled and you've landed and you're here, thank God. What are your priorities going forward?
To continue to serve our community, to publish the books and to find the writers and the voices that the bigger houses are unable to find, to do the work and to go to them, not expect them to come to us through the same system that is clearly broken. We have, fortunately, you know, far exceeded the crowdfund target, and so now are feeling safe that, you know, we're not going to disappear next year, that towards the end of this year we're going to find that there's no more money in the pot. And so our target and our aims, as they have always been, is to find new writers, to nurture new writers, and to sell as many books as possible, to show the industry that inclusive publishing and inclusive books, there's a commercial business case for it, as well as a moral need.
Aimée, thank you so much. Now, I'm going to go through some of the questions that we have here, and then I'm going to bring back Sandra and Anamik. So we're looking ahead, because I think that's what hopefully we know we're struggling, you know, the past, present, and the future with the discussion. Questions about mentoring has come up. I mean, that's a huge, I mean, for us, it was the colour, it's a huge issue. I mean, we're partnering with UCL and Spread the Word on the Take Flight Hub. You know, you can see the raft, this visual representation of writers covering all the spectrum and representing intersectionality to support writers. But that is a common, consistent request, and it's come here in the chats as well. So accessing mentoring opportunities. So if anyone wants to speak to that, I saw, Nikesh, that you said that you do a shout out in relation to that on Twitter as well. Right, lots of comments. I'm just looking for a question. A lot of kudos to everybody, and Nikesh. and Sunny in relation to Jhalak Prize. I think a lot of what's being said is resonating. And there's a comment here, the problem is that editorial is actually more white than ever before, especially editors with the power to acquire books. I'm an Asian woman and an editor. I've endured years of racist abuse and discrimination from senior white colleagues in editorial. So, you know, they changed my correct grammar and spellings because they assume I don't speak English. And they blame me for mistakes on books I didn't work on because they automatically assume that I'm responsible. So, I mean, that I can, you know, thank you for sharing that. So I think while I'm going through this now, I think that, and I'll identify some questions, Sandra and Anamik, pipeline, future publishing pipeline, and some of the recommendations that are in the report that speak to that. Sandra, do you want to start in relation to that and some of the things that you feel needs to be surfaced and actioned, like yesterday?
Yes, I just to repeat again, partner up with those organizations who already have the ties to the communities that the people are in. And one of the other recommendations sounds a bit like, yeah, it's just like, don't only look for new writers in the bigger cities, don't only go to London, go outside. And yeah, and one thing that always comes up too is that writers are also readers. So if you find the new writers, you'll also find new readers. So it's such a no-brainer. Just like go out and do the work. Don't be complacent. Don't just like wait for authors to come to you, but also go out. And because otherwise we're all missing out.
Anamik?
Yeah, one of the things I think in terms of rethinking diversity is I think we need publishers, as well as kind of making these kind of strategic actions that Sandra suggested, I think you need to fundamentally rethink the understandings, the assumptions, the logic you use when publishing writers of colour. So the assumption that people from marginalised backgrounds don't read, the assumption that, you know, writers of colour can only write about these particular stories, and if they try and break away from that, that makes them immediately, you know, lessens their commercial value. The idea that the assumption that stories about race are niche, the assumption that, you know, kind of, as I've said, you know, kind of audiences don't read, or writers or people of colour don't want to do these professions because, you know, we don't pay that much. All of these assumptions, you know, in the report, we don't necessarily dispel them all because we, you know, it was beyond the scope of the research. But nonetheless, those assumptions, whether they're, you know, maybe there's some element of truth of them, though that doesn't mean that they're not unsurmountable and they can't be fixed. But those assumptions are precisely what keep the hierarchies in place in terms of who runs the industry, essentially, who are in the kind of key gatekeeper roles, and those who are kind of marginalised and excluded from it. So that's what we want to encourage publishers to do, is to rethink that. So next time you say, I'm not sure there's a market for this writer, I like this, but we don't know where to position it, think about how those assumptions are themselves shaped by long histories of racism and exclusion more generally, that, you know, enable, let's face it, a particular class of people to remain at the top of status quo.
I have a question for you both, Anamik and Sandra. The question is around, if you could say a bit about the methodology you used for the report and the research, and how you selected those to interview.
Sandra, do you want to?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. Well, first of all, we wanted to have like the conglomerates as well as indies represented. And we also, we started working together with the AAA, so the Agents Association, with the Publishers Association, the Booksellers Association, to get like in contact with as many people as possible. We wanted to make sure that we're not only asking people of color to fix the problem and talk about diversity once more. So we made sure that we talked to a lot of white people as well. And well, to be honest, like in the leading positions, they were all white people, basically. Yeah, so we talked to indies, we talked to conglomerates. We wanted to make sure that we talked to people who represent every process in the way from agenting all the way to book selling and festivals. We started out with a plan to interview 80 people. But I think in the end, we ended up with 113 because we wanted to get as full a picture as possible. And while some people were pointed out to us like, oh, this would be a good person to talk to, we also did research. We looked at people's social media profiles. We looked who published books that we really liked. We looked at front lists that looked interesting. We wanted to get an insight behind the rationale behind that. So yeah, we tried to come up with a mixture also of people who we thought were doing good already and others who had some way to go, because we wanted to get as big of a picture as possible.
A question that is been raised for Aimée, but I want to bring in Nikesh and Sunny with this. In terms of the role of social media, because one thing that, you know, again, is I'm trying to, obviously, for us to broach new topics, but I still need to bring some of the points raised from the launch event, which is the fact that a lot of the time, the audiences that we have online have been pivotal to the success. For example, The Good Immigrant, for example, in terms of the Jhalak Prize, and also in terms of Nights Of. So the question here is, you know, if you can share a bit about how you utilize social media to be in the position that you are in terms of raising your profile and having a direct contact with your target audience.
Yeah.
And and what has been the benefits, but also what have been the drawbacks as well with that? The eyebrow raise.
Sorry.
No, that speaks volumes. Yeah.
Yeah, I think if we miss a day on social media, and I'm talking Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, then we fear our voice will become defunct. And I think that's something that's very personal to us as a company, and we've always known from the beginning. I mean, we launched without books, and so our intention was always first and foremost to find our community, to talk to them directly, and to also have them hold us accountable for when we misstep and for when we do things wrong. And we've always been very open in that. We ask them, what do they need from us? What are we doing wrong? What are we doing right? And I think having that open level of communication invites not only new readers, for us parents who have got questions all the time about what they should be giving their child to read, but also it draws writers to us as well. You know, we have unsolicited submissions process across the company, and so we have that direct line to writers in a way that many other publishers don't. And I think we are engaged in wider conversation in a way that perhaps other children's publishers aren't. It doesn't always have to be about the books. It can be, you know, wider issues that we get engaged with, and make sure that our voice is as loud in those conversations as possible. I think that's what's worked for us, and that's what we're going to continue to do. You know, we have to, like I've said before, go to the community, not expect them to find us. If they're online, that's where we have to be.
Thank you, Aimée. Sunny, is there anything you want to say or add to that in relation to Jhalak?
Yeah, I do. I have to say, you know, I mean, it's quite strange because, you know, Nikesh and I co-founded the prize, but Nikesh and I met on Twitter. So Twitter is where I sell books, because I don't think either of my last two books had any public, you know, PR, marketing, publicity budget. So whatever sales have happened, they've happened there through my use of social media. For my novel, I created a hashtag, Where Books Go, asking readers to send me pictures from wherever they were reading the book. And, you know, but those are things, you know, I shouldn't have to do that. Also, I'm a writer. That's not my area of expertise. But I think there's a conversation to be had around what publishers do in terms of who they hire for marketing and sales and PR. They're often using, you know, I meet people who I just go, wait, you don't actually have a marketing background. You don't actually have a degree in what you're supposedly working in. You just have the right profile. And you know exactly what that right profile is. So I think that there's a lot more to be thought about. I mean, for me, Twitter is where I find my community. That's where my writer friends are. That's where my academic friends are. But I also want to flag up something that's really important. That's where I connect with my readers. And then I'm going to loop back to what I said about white writers. I am fascinated to see white writers who basically follow and talk to only other white writers. They don't follow people like us. And I can count in my, in my follow list, people who will listen to us. Then they will write, then they will hold forth about how angry and aggressive writers of color are. They don't even hear us. So I'm going to put this out as a challenge to white writers today. How many of us are you following? And you know what? The work of learning, to quote Flavia Sudan, is done in silence. Follow us, listen to us. Don't step up by being defensive. Listen to us, and then we'll talk. Because right now, I'm seeing this going round and round in circles, and that's not good enough. And I will repeat, it's a moral failure.
Thank you, Sunny. Nikesh.
Yeah, I think Aimée and Sunny said pretty much everything that I want to say. I think the way that Nights of views social media is just always an inspiration. I don't think I have like an active plan, but like just to add a thing to the discussion that I think people don't necessarily see is like, because I am all I've ever wanted to do is write. Like I'm an awkward guy who just like sits quietly and write. I just want to write fiction, but I've kind of accidentally through The Good Immigrant fallen into writing non-fiction. And what's weird about doing non-fiction is it suddenly puts you in terms of like the middle class intelligentsia colomerati people. It sort of makes them think that you're some sort of public intellectual who has like some sort of authority to speak on lots and lots of things, and it puts you in the firing line. Like I get like so much racist abuse on Twitter just for writing, like to the point where like I've been doxxed. I've had people try and like contact employers of mine. I've had columns at the Spectator about what a fat chubby samosa I am, and all that stuff takes a toll, and all I wanted to do was write. And so like when it comes to who I use social media for, like I'm not using social media to make any grand pontificating statements about the state of the nation. I'm literally just like trying to make this world accessible for other writers of color who don't understand how the world works. Because like as I said before, like people held the door open for me, and I will continue to hold the door open for other people as much as I can. And that's all I really can use social media for, because ultimately, if truth be told, I'd much rather just be talking about Spider-Man comics on social media with like my nerd friends, but I don't get to do that, So like, it is a really hard thing using social media and talking about this stuff, because like the other thing, to just add to what Sunny says, like we say all this stuff and then white writers spin it into like 20,000 tweet threads, like make it sound really highly intellectual, and they get all the like all their love from the industry, whereas we're just seen as the angry people with the chips on our shoulder. And like at some point you have to go, well, maybe I do have a chip on my shoulder, and maybe it's justified that it's there, because actually this is taking like how many times have people quoted that Toni Morrison quote about racism being a distraction to the work that you're meant to be doing? Like it is a distraction. Like all of this stuff is a distraction to the work that we all want to be doing, which is finding amazing books and like writing amazing books and putting amazing books out and giving those amazing books the same fighting chance that a book that had a 7-figure advance by a white writer that was sort of seen as like the one book that you must read about illegal immigration, like it gave them the same fighting chance as that,
I want to thank you, Nikesh. Maybe on a lighter note, I just want to sort of position myself to be your future possible agent, because you said you're just an awkward guy, and straight away I thought awkward guy, Issa Rae, HBO. So if they come calling, make sure you check in with me. All right. I can see that now. So it's out there, people. So another question from Mary Abrahams, who is of Renaissance One, again, been in the field for a long time supporting writers and speaking volumes. I want to give a shout out to as well, who are doing amazing work supporting writers here and overseas. Her question, how might we support the presses, organizations and initiatives created by people of color for whom supporting writers of color is everyday work, as well as change conditions for writers? Anyone want to say anything, Emma, in relation to that? And also the brilliant work of editors and agents of colour, you know, many of whom we still don't know who are doing this work. Patsy Isles, who, you know, used to, you know, be in publishing, she stepped away, but used to be known Patsy Antoine Isles. You know, worked, you know, developed a lot of the Spread the Words writer development programs. I mean, there's a lot of people who do this and step away and do other stuff, and she's a writer herself, and she's now focusing on her writing 20 years on. Yeah, so Emma, any responses to that from Melanie?
I mean, one of the things I'd really like to see, I mean, this goes back to my earlier point, is for the current power dynamic to be completely disrupted. And, you know, I don't think it's enough actually for the existing majority white agents to suddenly open the gates or open the doors. I think we need really urgent and committed investment in putting black and brown agents, black and brown commissioners in those roles. I mean, you know, a lot of people have said that today. But for me, I think any other changes will be completely cosmetic, or that they won't endure. So I think for me, what I really want to see from people who can make those investments is for that power balance to be disrupted and completely changed. Thank
you, Emma. Just one more question now before we round up. This question from Maya Grant. Thank you, Maya. How has a lack of representation of BAME staffing in senior positions affected the exposure of BAME authors and race-related books? And this is someone who is doing, and again, shout out to all those PhD students who are choosing to research this area and are speaking to those, you know, who are capturing this so it can be archived. So when they say we weren't here, we were, so they can figure that out. But Anamik, Sandra, yeah, in terms of your take and response to that question about the lack of representation of senior staff of colour and how that impacts on BAME authors and exposure. Yeah.
Firstly, I just want to say, for anyone else who's doing research in this area, whether in an academic context or not, please do get in contact. I'd be happy to share my experiences and views and any thoughts that might be helpful to you. One of the things I found in my research beyond publishing, so this is like one part of kind of a long, well, not too long, but a history of research that I've done throughout the cultural industries. And one of the things I found is that such is the kind of constraining, if you like, environment of cultural industries, that people of colour themselves can end up internalising some of those assumptions, logics, understandings that I referred to earlier. Because in the end, kind of being able to make it in these industries kind of demands conforming to a certain extent to the, you know, institutional cultures or indeed whiteness of these spaces. In which case, it's obviously, I'm not for a second going to suggest that we shouldn't bother trying to bring in more people of colour into the industry, but doing so needs to be done on the basis that they are given the space and the resources to flourish. They need to have the same, they need to be afforded the same creative freedoms as their white counterparts. Something that's come up on several times during the week of events that we've had is that people of colour should have the freedom to fail as much as their white counterparts. I actually kind of, the more we did this, realised I saw that's kind of what privilege kind of affords certain people, is that ability to fail and not have any consequences and be able to do your work as normal. I mean, you know, let's face it, publishing, cultural production generally in publishing and beyond is an inherently unpredictable and risky business. And so it means that people need to take risks. And fortunately, when people of colour take those risks and there's an inevitable failure, then this is seen as a kind of mark upon people of colour more generally, or the books of people of colour. Oh, look, here's evidence that this didn't work. And that's not how book publishing works. There's, you know, loads of hits and flops, which there's no rhyme or reason why that is the case. So yes, we need more people of colour in the industry, but as Emma says, we've got to be careful that it's not just cosmetic, and that they need to be given the space, the autonomy, the freedoms to, as much as their white counterparts.
As is the way, at the last minute, all of a sudden when people realise we're winding up, loads of questions. There were loads of comments, and I was scrolling down, and now there's loads of questions. But some of them, there's answers to them through our IG Instagram account, because there's been 2 IG live talks hosted by us and chaired by Anamik, and with people like Dorothy Coomson, with Charmaine Lovegrove. So some of the questions, for example, any suggestions for getting the bookshops to stock books by writers of colour, and also about how to more directly engage with BAME communities. I mean, those are just some of the questions. So have a look, go over to Words of Colour. They're there, watch them, still send through your questions. We will, as you know, we're recording this session, and what we will do, we'll make both the launch and this final session live, so you'll be able to see next week. And so as we now hit the time to close this conversation and discussion, thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to Anamik and Sandra for putting in 2 years of hard sweat and graft to produce the report. Thank you to Sunny, to Nikesh, to Aimée, to Emma, and also to Derek, who sadly obviously couldn't be with us, but hopefully he feels some of his questions were responded to. Also, I would like to thank Sharon and Ali, who've been working incredibly hard as our BSL interpreters. Also to the bookseller for hosting this on their platform, and also being a partner as well as spread the word. And I also, I just feel that, about the past connects with the present, and we've spoken about those on which shoulders we walk. People like Margaret Busby, Bernard Wilkins, who are still active, who are still mentoring, who are still supporting people now. Courtney Newland, who was mentioned earlier on, who I had the pleasure of working with, and, who brought up the whole idea of writing the future for that to happen. So again, a lot of the impetus coming from Black writers and writers of colour. So please also, I'm going to ask you all one thing. Before we go, let us know in the comments, in the next sort of couple of seconds, what are you going to do differently in your spaces to keep this discussion alive? Because, we've come to the end of the Rethinking Diversity in Publishing Week, or Rethinking Diversity week. So please engage with that hashtag, because the discussion is not ended here. Actually, before we go, Anamik and Sandra, so please, I'm serious about putting in the comments what you're going to do differently if you are a white marketeer, retailer, online bookseller, publisher who's engaged with us today, writer. Let us know, just declare it. What are you going to do differently in your spaces, personal and professional, okay, to keep this alive? And also what you want to do and would like to do. And I say to Anamik and Sandra, thank you once again, but how would you like, I think the final word should really go to you two in terms of the next steps and what you hope to do and achieve with this report and who you hope to engage with.
Sandra, do you want to go first?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, first of all, I was really pleased and surprised by all the replies and responses we got so far. We heard from some board members of the Big Four, we heard from the AAA, so apparently some people have been listening, which is great, and that was kind of also our fear, that we are putting out all these information that most people of color already knew, and trying to make recommendations, so it's now up to the industry to take them up. So, but there seems to be some discussion already. What really touched me was how many people said that they felt heard and seen by the report, and how many people shared their stories in the comments, how many people already made connections in the comments and so on. So I hope that for the future that this is gonna spark something more sustainable than we had before. And I believe that our conversations have shown that there's a real, there's so much untapped potential, not least in the audiences, and a real threat of brain drain if the industry just continues with this as usual. So I think one of the core parts of our report was that people should rethink their audiences, publishers and booksellers in particular, because this informs all the other steps on the way, and it would be really great to see some action there and not just talk.
Anamik?
I just want to reiterate everything that Sandra said. I think one of the it's been amazing to see the response to the report, not least on social media. And also, I just want to take this opportunity to thank absolutely everyone who's been involved in the week of events, the events we've had this week, not least the panel today, which has been brilliant, but also everyone else who were involved in the last 3 days. And thank you, Joy, for pulling it all together. It's been amazing to be a part of this conversation. And unfortunately, this is only just the start. I think we need to move away from the benign language of diversity. You know, we put diversity in inverted commas in the report. I've been doing a lot of this all week. And I think we need to put it to bed. I mean, the publishing industry needs to think about how it can be more actively anti-racist. You know, Black Lives Matter, the protests that have happened in the last few weeks have kind of produced a profound reckoning, I think, on the behalf of the industry. And now I think a lot of it is genuine. Unfortunately, there'll always be discussions about to what extent are these performative and so on. But what's happened in the industry recently in terms of its, like I said, its own reckoning with its own institutional whiteness, coupled with what has been going on politically right now, I think there is a real moment to actually turn this into something meaningful, rather than when we look back at it in years to come and kind of think about, wasn't it funny that there was this, all of a sudden Black authors were in the bestsellers list that one week, and then disappeared again. That's what we can't let happen. And it's up to the industry to ensure that, that complacency that was there in the past, is dealt with. And actually, as I said, these issues are dealt with in a more proactively anti-racist and indeed intersectional manner. So this is about race. We've had to focus on race and ethnicity because of the scale of the report, but this is about gender, sexuality, class, disability, and so on. The findings in the report, I think, will resonate across people interested in all of those different types of identities, if you like. So, that's all I have to say. Thank you, everyone, for being a part of today, and thank you, Joy, again, for chairing brilliantly and putting this all together.
Well, total pleasure. So, look, once again, thanks to Sunny, Nikesh, Emma, and Aimée, also to Jennifer from the Words of Colour team, and also to Emma from the Bookseller team for moderating today behind the scenes. It's been a total pleasure to work with you on this, and thank you for trusting me, because I know the plan was to launch it in the public space in real life, and then you had to trust us for us to bring you online, and for us to spread this over 4 days, and I think it has gone really well. So thanks to everyone. Again, Rethinking Diversity and Rethinking Diversity Week, but from this point on it will be Rethinking Diversity in terms of the hashtag. Be safe, have a great weekend, and thanks for joining us once again.
Thanks, everyone. See you again soon.
Bye.
Bye.